Well, I'm here with Bill Joslin. Bill, welcome to the Gnostic Media Podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here.
And Bill, I had mentioned an upcoming interview with you on my interview with Frater X with Joe Atwill the other day, and going into the sort of history and more dark side of meditation that isn't normally discussed. It's sort of like, when you think of, most people's idea of shamanism in the Western world, it's been really whitewashed and watered down, and what's been sold or presented to the middle class North American public, essentially, and maybe Europe as well.
Mm.
And this, and back early on in the show, episode number 6, I interviewed this Professor Neil Whitehead, who goes into dark shamanism and all of this stuff, that it really exposes this whole other half of shamanism that's really been omitted. And, apparently your work and your history of meditation and everything sort of brings the same light to meditation. So, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and who you are, and how first off did you get into meditation?
I got into meditation. It was just an interest in awareness in itself. It wasn't a spiritual interest or some desire to touch the face of God. I was actually interested in awareness itself. And this led me to start studying three different disciplines under a number of teachers. One is Nyingmapa Buddhism, which is the original form of Tibetan Buddhism. Bon Po, which is the precursor to Nyingmapa Buddhism, and certain practices from Taoism. And I had done this for about 16 years, and I taught briefly. And after sort of vetting the information for myself and having to reevaluate it, I came to see it as essentially a means for teachers to control students. I had gained a lot from it, but none of it was what they were claiming it to be.
When you say method for teachers to control students, I suppose we're going to be going into that as we go here, but can you put that in a nutshell as what people are about to get into here?
Well, I think if you look at the mechanics of what happens with meditation, uh, it takes on a spiritual connotation in terms of the experience, or a spiritual context, only because of the interaction with the teacher in the first place. And it becomes an impossible task to
I
attain for the
had
student. Yep.
a
Go
girlfriend
ahead.
many years ago, maybe more than a decade ago, and she was always talking about her master. And every time
Yeah.
would discuss something or want to do something, this or that, she had to talk to her master. What was that about?
Well, if you when we get through this, you'll see that the dynamic is set up prior to students beginning the practices, and then what keeps them engaged to continue to practice is a method in which a person hands over the authority of their reality to a teacher. So essentially, the teacher becomes the one that decides what's real
So
or
it's
not for the
almost like
student.
the compulsory education system in a way, right? And by the way,
Yeah,
you're a homeschooler, is that correct?
yeah. We're just finishing up our
So
first year of
that's
homeschooling.
an interesting touch there. All right, so Bill, what is meditation?
Well, I think to get into what meditation is, you have to have a common ground on what the mind is. Uh, and
And you're just getting over a cold,
essentially,
so I'll
yeah,
throw that out there for everyone.
yeah, I'll be
All
coughing and
right.
sniffling a little bit. Yeah. So before we can talk about what goes on in meditation, or at least deconstruct to come up to a definition of meditation, you have to have a common ground, which is what is the mind, or what is awareness, and what goes on in awareness.
All right. So
Okay.
you say that we need a faculty to collect data. So why don't we go? What is the faculty of awareness? And Typically when we use the trivium, we think of five senses, but you actually are, and these other two that you mentioned do come up on occasion, but you mentioned a couple of others. So why don't you go into those?
Okay, so we have obviously an ability to collect information from the world, and we generally think of it in terms of eyes, ears,
And let me
nose,
just interrupt
touch, taste,
on
and so
the
on.
PDF download that's going to be available for this episode. Everyone, sorry, we're just now mentioning it. This will be page 2 of the thing, Faculty of Awareness, Sensory Data. Sorry about that, Bill.
Okay, no problem. We also have two other physical senses. And when I mean a physical sense, I mean there's an organ attached to actually sensing the data. And that's proprioception, which is body position or awareness of our own physical body. And we collect that data through tension and pressure receptors in our joints and muscle. But we also have a sense of balance and a sense of motion, which is essentially our body in orientation to the world, which is through the inner ear. Can't remember what it's called right now, but it's essentially our sense of balance. Now, that's collecting raw data, but that's not the only things that we're aware of when we're aware of the world. And it's not there has to be other means of awareness before we can be conscious. So that would
All
be the
right, so
next
that's
slide.
slide 3. All right, so faculty of awareness and then processed awareness. All right. Well, let me
Yeah.
just
So
ask
now,
you. So you've got on here spatial awareness, intensity, quality, mental preoccupation, or no, I'm sorry, proprioception. Excuse me. So
proprioception.
let's go through these one at a time. Spatial awareness.
Right, so we need to be aware of space, distance from us, orientation left, right, up, down. We need a space to think, essentially. And we have awareness of space, or we'd be walking into each other all the time. Uh, Spatial awareness is a processing of a number of our senses at the same time, from sight to physical proprioception and so on. And it also necessitates the next one, which is intensity and quality. Things are smaller, larger, brighter, dimmer, and so on. So we need to be able to sense quality in our sensory data.
Quality, basically attributes and things like that. Correct.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
rough versus soft. To be able to contrast and compare things within the same type of sensory data, we need to be able to have a sense of quality.
All right. So mental
Proprios,
proprioception. Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah, proprioception. So we also have a mental sense of self. So this would be the ability to be able to tell that what I'm imagining in my mind is of myself and in my mind, and not something out there in the world. In terms of the brain, it's actually being processed and created by the exact same organ in the brain. But we have a boundary that says on this side of it, it's us, on that side of it's the world. And that becomes a mental sense of self or a mental object of self. Okay, and then the last one is temporal awareness. And you could argue that temporal awareness, is a physical sense as well, because uh, it could be thought of as at the rate at which we create memories. If we're in an intense situation and we create memories faster, it appears to us that time has slowed down because the rate at which we've created has increased, and then vice versa. If there's not much, we're not creating many memories, time seems to rush past us. So there is some argument that there could be a physical sense attached to that, but I think to a great extent where it's also highly processed from the other sensory data.
All right, so you've got what is this, page 4 here? You've got a head looking down at the coffee cup. What's going
Yeah.
on here?
So once we have this faculty of attention, we have an open field of data collection, essentially. We have the ability to perceive. At this point, though, this does not necessarily mean that we're aware or self-aware or conscious, but we have attributes, physical attributes that allow us to be aware of the world. And it's important to just note that that's a blanket field of attention. And if you actually look at the word attention, attente means under stress or strain, and that means without. So it's physical awareness without tension or without focus. It's just a field of sensory data, a field of perception. Okay.
All right. So perception, transmutation of sensory data into awareness.
Right. So that being said, that sensory data does not connotate that we're aware yet. Uh, so to become aware, there's a number of sort of objects that need to be placed. There's an ontology that needs to be created within our mind for us to be aware of the world. And part of being aware of the world is being self-aware. Okay, so I'm just going to read the slide through here.
Okay.
To be aware of the world, we must first be able to collect information. That's our faculty of sensory data. This is done through our field of attention. Okay. But to be aware, we need to be able to reflect upon the data collected. And to be able to reflect upon the world, we must first create a perception of the world. To do this, one has to recreate the situation within the mind and then reflect upon this recreated world. We need to first position a point of view and then position the objects in the world around this point of view or relative to this point of view. So first we create a self and then position the world related to this self. So you can try this. If you imagine an object, a coffee cup or something, close your eyes and imagine it, and it's there in your mind, you're seeing it. Where are you seeing it? You're seeing it somewhere out in front of you. So that means that there is a point of view as well as the coffee cup. Okay, and that point of view becomes the sort of the very basic foundation of self. Okay, so there's our drawing of it. The next slide, page 6. We have a point. We've positioned our point of view, and then we've positioned the object relative to that point of view.
All right.
All right. So within perception,
And
we
we're on
find the
slide
world
7 now?
related. Our
All
slide
right.
7. Yeah, we find the world related to the self. Okay, and this is sort of important that because we position a point of view and then position the world around it, the self and world are defined at the same time. One exists because of the other and vice versa. The two are intertwined and dependent upon each other. So in attention, we find the self in relation to the world. In perception, we find the world related to the self. Okay, so awareness of the world and definition of the self are intrinsically interwoven and interdependent on this, are interdependent. Each rely on the other for awareness to exist. Okay, so to be able to compare and contrast the world, we create a perception, and then we compare that against our sensory data. Okay, and then to modify that perception or modify that world to have it match up against the sensory data, we need to modify the self first. So the self and world are both being modified in that perception. So this is the process of defining a self and defining the world, and it's always happening in parallel. It happens to both at the same time. And it's a process of reality testing. This is how we reality test, and this is how we come to create accurate perceptions of the world, how we create a map of the terrain that represents the terrain accurately, and how we assimilate information of the world into consciousness. Okay?
All right.
So I've got the drawing on the next slide on page 8.
Assimilation.
Yeah, assimilation of the information. So this process of reality testing, this feedback loop or this test loop, is how we assimilate the information. We've created the perception in the circle in the forehead there with the point of view, the self as an object, and then the object itself. And then we return back to the field of awareness, the faculty of the sensory data, and we measure the two to see if they match. Then if they don't, we come back up, we modify that perception by modifying the self and the world, and then measure it against the sensory data again. And this is an ongoing pre-conscious process. This is not something that we're aware of. Okay, so I'll go on to the description now on page 9.
All right.
Okay, so to be aware, a self-object is needed. Then the world is to be positioned in relation to the self. So this is necessary to be able to reflect upon the self and the world. So the process is important. First, we create a self as an object, Then we create the world around that self, and then we have a point of view that then reflects upon that self and that object together in the world. And this is the birth of self-awareness, being aware of my own awareness.
All right.
Okay? Um, so this creates the boundary between myself and the world. So we're talking about mental proprioception. This is what creates that mental proprioception. We've created a mental object of self. And that creates the boundary between what's me and what's the world. So it lets me know that what I'm imagining in my head isn't something that's happening out there in the world. If I imagine my wife with fangs and horns, it doesn't mean she has fangs and horns, and so on. That the boundary is very important, right? This is what allows us to be in touch with reality, is to be able to tell what's of me and what's of the world. What's my thoughts, my imagination, my emotions, what's my physical self, and then what is of the world, and that making that distinction. And that boundary, the world definition and the self definition, becomes a structure that can contain information about the world. It creates a vehicle for expression.
Is this page 11?
No, we're still on page 9, the very end of it. The self world objects contain the experience.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so if any one of these elements are not there, experience isn't possible.
Got it.
If you have no awareness of the world, there's no experience. If there's no awareness of self, there's no awareness. If there's no temporal awareness, there's no way to reflect upon it. There's no awareness. So all of these elements have to be in place before there's any experience at all. So this is what I mean, that that the self world objects that we create creates a vehicle for experience. Okay. So we'll go on to page 10.
All right. Assimilation.
Okay. Yeah. So what happens when we have this structure created? Occasionally, or quite often, we'll encounter new information or information that's too much for the container. It doesn't fit in the structures that we've created, or it conflicts with it. Okay. So we then continue through a process of assimilation, but we can start to become aware of that. Okay. So as new information, which is relevant to the self, is encountered, it's assimilated into awareness through these definitions. Okay, if there's no context for the information, then we don't categorize it. We've encountered it. It could even be there in our memory, but there's no way to recall it in the memory.
You basically just file it somewhere. It doesn't relate to anything, right?
That's right. It's irrelevant, so we ignore it. Much like the texture on the wall is irrelevant a second after we walk in. We don't put any attention into that any longer. So we can have experiences in life where there's information that didn't fit our framework that is there in our memory, but we just never recall it because it's never relevant. So when if the context changes and it becomes irrelevant, then that information can now come into consciousness.
And you see a lot of times hypnotists, hypnotherapists, etc., will use hypnosis to go in and get sort of the other minutia in memories to pull things out. Would that relate?
Yeah, and it happens to us all the time. I mean, if you have a cheating spouse, there you could go through 6 months of them being a little cold, working late at night, and you have no context for why that's happening. If your context included this is a cheating spouse, then you might be aware of it right away. So we can be deceived by having people create the context of experience for us. If somebody else is defining the context, yeah.
Interesting. Right. So if they're telling you what to think or et cetera, instead of you relying on your own sensory input, 5, 7, whatever, I suppose in this case it would be the main 5. But you would go out, hopefully, and gather more information to figure out why you have these contradictions, so you're not just wondering, is this a cheating spouse, or are they working late, or what's
so
going
what
on?
I'm getting at through the whole presentation is that meditation is a way of corrupting the senses so that you would never be aware of the contradiction. It's a way of defining context so that you maintain uncategorized information essentially.
So essentially, it's almost a form of hypnosis in itself, because you're implanting the ideas in the direction of the thought. You're creating the feedback loop for the person to follow through where any contradictions may
Right.
appear.
And as long as the contradiction isn't relative to the context, you have no context to relate to it, you'll never be aware of it. So we have this in marketing, we have it in the
Right.
school system.
So if you never go out of the system to collect more
Yeah.
information, then it keeps
Yeah.
it constant. So the second you go outside of that, then it
Right. So
corrupts
now,
it.
if just to go on a bit of a side note, most people that are interested in things like shamanism or meditation, it's because they have an innate sense that there's something missing. There's something wrong with the world. There's something more. This is the emergence of a contradiction with a worldview that you've been handed. So we go off to explore what's missing in the world. Why is it like this? And we fall into
and
meditation.
they've got a ready-made what I call the sort of secondary catch web right there, ready to catch you. If you fall out of the major religions, and in this case, Eastern philosophy, that is their major religion. But it's like I suppose they might fall into
Yeah,
Christianity or something. Who
yeah,
knows?
yeah,
But
yeah, and
sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
and I find that in that if you look, especially in the West, if you look at traditions that are that have popularity, whether it's Oriental meditation or you have New Age movement or you have this neo shamanism, they each have their own demographic, and those demographics can be defined by people that would naturally become aware of the contradiction and fight the contradiction. So if you're not in the main in the middle, that you would never find the contradiction because that context is set. If you're starting to trickle out onto the edges, they have catch-alls. If you're about independence and self-reliance over here, you'll fall into sort of Native American shamanism. And if you're uh, a more compassionate person that would stand up for the starving in the world, you'll fall right into New Age or Oriental thinking. So these things, these things attract very particular
They're
demographic.
where they need
Yeah,
to be, and they're just in the wheel of life, and this is all just a reflection of yourself. So don't act. Is that kind
yeah.
of where you go
And
with
if you
that?
happen to fall out of the middle, you fall out of, if you're starting to wake up, you'll fall into one of these buckets based on your demographic. If you're self reliant, you
Wow.
fall into sort of wilderness survival and native spirituality. If you're more compassionate and feel a lot of empathy for other people, you fall off of that into new age movements and so on. So and these things, I believe, are, if they're not intentionally designed that way, they've evolved and maintained their position in our culture because of this dynamic. Okay, so
So it doesn't really matter which way you go in their system. That they try to have a preconceived belief system ready for you to fall into any direction you go. That's very
yeah, and then
interesting.
the other quality with each one of these is that they all have a quality of being marginalized. You're a crazy hippie. You're a psycho survivalist or whatever. You've fallen out of the mainstream. You're now falling into a bucket, into a whole other loop of mind control, and you're being discredited at the same time. And you don't need anybody at the wheel. It's a system that runs itself. Yeah. So one of the main keys to this, which I don't know if we'll get into it too much here, is emotional analysis and navel gazing, and how that ties in so much to New Age movement and spirituality in the West. Because emotional processing, when you're in Asia and talking, this does not come into the practices at all. So I want to say a little bit of something about emotion around this, which
All
I've,
right.
I've got in the slide here. And this could be a book in and of itself.
This is
This
slide
is
10.
still slide 10. So I'll just start off in the middle. As the definitions of world and self change to accommodate and assimilate new information, we gain insight we find this as a positive experience. I should back up. So the idea here is that you have a structure of self and world as a context. New information comes in. When those two things conflict, we feel a tension, quite literally a psychic tension. And I'm not talking psychic in a mamby-pamby sort of way. It's a tension in the mind or a negative emotion. We experience an emotion. And it's simply a tension created between either too much information for the context or the structure that we have for experience. It's conflicting information or it's new information coming in. So the initial stages are usually uncomfortable. As that worldview and self worlds start to change to accommodate this new information, that tension's released. The tension subsides. So we feel it as a positive experience. As the tension's released, it could feel like an elation, the aha, I've got an insight, that this person loves me, which is just affirming a self-doubt that you don't have to confront anymore. So the idea that emotion is really about the relationship between the data that's outside of the structure and how the structure is reacting to it. So it's important to note that emotion has no information in and of itself. All it tells us is that there's incoming information and where to look. And the severity of the emotion is really the motivation to continue with it. So it gives us a focus, gives us a motivation to assimilate the new information, but it tells us nothing about reality. It's only that new information is being resisted or assimilated. Emotion is not information. It's the reaction to new or conflicting information. Okay, that's my diatribe on that.
All right, so let's see here. What you got
9/11.
next here? All right, when information rises into awareness, it is an obscure and rough form. It is in
Yeah.
an obscure and rough form.
So this is the idea: is that we're really moving from obscurity to clarity. The whole process of assimilation is going from obscurity to clarity. So we initially encounter it, it's raw sensory data, no context, no meaning, no relevance. It's raw and obscure. Okay. Initially, we're aware of it as excuse me, physical sensation, impressions, intuitions. It's symbolic. It's metaphoric. There's no clarity. As the process of assimilation progresses, the information becomes clearer, it gains context, and is more refined. So as this structure changes and new information comes in, that structure has to expand. The information becomes clear. Impressions, visions, intuitions are form given to information. It's in a language which is particular to your predilections, tailored to your mind. And it's specifically, especially intuition, it's spoken in the same language as body language. So we express with our body, and when intuitions come up and it's very physical feeling, it's speaking in a language, and that's body language. Visions, experiences that we have in meditation and so on, those will be tailor-made. The form of the information will take a form that's particular to your interests at that time, but it tells you about your mind. As it refines, the language clarifies, and awareness clarifies until you become conscious of the information as it is. Okay? So, as attributes and relationships pop into clarity, we experience this as insight. So, I'm saying attributes and relations here specifically that we're talking about attributes of an object. So, we have an object. As we come into clarity about certain facets of it, we experience these as insights. So, we haven't come to a complete distinction yet. We've only come to a complete attribute, an awareness of the attribute of that object. And when this happens, usually the mind kicks up. It's like, oh, there it is. And then we see it everywhere. And then, you can't stop talking about it. It's like when you want to go buy a new car and you're thinking, I'm going to buy a blue car, all of a sudden you notice blue cars everywhere. It says the mind has a preoccupation with the insight because it's simply trying to reinforce the insight into awareness. And it's doing this because now it needs to move on to the next bit of conflicting information. Okay, so this is dramatic. This is the mystical insight. This is the eureka or the aha moment. When enough of these attributes come together, so we've gained enough attributes of the object to be able to actually define it. We begin to assimilate the complete awareness of that object. We experience this as a distinction. So I'm using my own vocabulary here between insight and distinction. That we distinctly see this as something separate from that, as opposed to an insight. When a distinction pops, the mind relaxes. It doesn't kick up into activity. We don't get excited about it. It goes whoo. And when it rests in awareness. So the mind naturally calms. Mental dialogue quiets because there's nothing left to think about. Distinctions are not dramatic. They're, oh, okay, I see. And the reason why the mind rests in awareness is because when a distinction pops, all of the definition, the attributes, all of the structure that we've been creating in perception becomes self-evident. So we find the definition in the observation of the object at that point. The perception takes a back seat. Okay. So the insights are seen as facets of the larger object. They're part of a larger understanding. So if you're meditating, you're getting insight after insight, you're not there yet. There's still more work. Okay. Go ahead.
That's interesting. So the more insights you have, the more you need to narrow it down.
Yeah, and what I find is what most people do, done this, had students that did this, seen lots of colleagues, they end up continually redefining the same insights. Oh, I've had an insight. And then they go away and they meditate and they come back with a new insight. And it's really just a rewrite of 2 or 3 other insights they've had, but they've not taken a step forward. This is part of that method of control. You're in an impossible situation where all you're doing is bumping into insights, but never gaining the distinction. So the other thing about this whole process is it's natural. This isn't something out there that we have to learn how to do. It's happening all the time. It always has been happening. It's happening right now. It'll always be there. But we can't interfere with it. So it's important to note that the whole process of assimilating information is pre-conscious, though.
And we're on
on page 12.
12, right?
Yeah, on
right.
12. That the idea that you can do this, that you can sit down and meditate to come to an awareness is a bit of an illusion. Even insight meditation does not meditate on insight. It meditates on letting go of responses to emotion and data. The insight emerges on its own. The mind is doing this all the time. It's a perfectly natural process. But we can get in the way of it. And how we do this is by responding too quickly to the information. So we start to get an intuition and we go, this must be it. Or we have a vision and go, that's what it is. And we draw these conclusions. And then we assert them back to the world as true. Okay, so we
without verifying the data or the information.
That's right, and without even coming to clarity of awareness, that it's like something happened there.
So it's like you channel it essentially, and then you take it as fact. Is that what
fact? As fact. And the thing is that in that channeled experience, if you were to allow it to continue without any interference, that interference is either not pushing it away and negating it, but also not clinging onto it and becoming it. Now I'm a channeler. If you were to simply allow it to be, it would come to a distinction that is based in information, not in mysticism. Okay, so how we get in the way is by attempting to end what is a negative experience or by clinging on to a positive one. So getting rid of visions of demons while you're meditating, or clinging onto the fact that you're the adopted son of Kuan Yin. Because so many times people get stuck on this self-importance trip. They'll get an insight, and then all of a sudden I'm enlightened. Or they'll have a negative experience in meditation. Oh, it's evil. So those are extreme examples. We do this in everyday life too, that, we screw up at work and we want to avoid it, right? Because it feels terrible. Well, if you allow yourself to feel it without responding to it, you'll gain insight and understanding into yourself and your own competency. So you talked about in I think one of your podcasts about incompetence not being aware of itself.
Right.
Incompetence it can
It's
because of
I think
this.
Dunning and Kruger's
Yeah,
paper.
yeah, and essentially all we're talking about the exact same dynamic through all of this. That we are, in terms of reality testing, somewhat incompetent. We have a structure that can contain only so much reality. And we're not aware, and by how our minds are structured, we can never be aware of what we're incompetent about. So when we're confronted by huge emotions, events that spark huge emotions, where this structure of self and world is being really confronted, what's happening is the information that's outside, the stuff that's outside of our competence, what we're incompetent with, is pushing its way in. So this is how you become more competent. This is how you create better coping of the world, is by not responding to the emotion. It's not time to
Right, and
respond yet.
always, yeah, exactly. You know, it's funny what I do with my son is we created this concept. Kids and you have a young child, they have those science kits for homeschool and things like that. And one of them was like this slime stuff that you put it in a jar and you put water in there and it turns into this big thing of slime. So we had this idea of the slime jar. And whenever we need to get serious thinking done, the emotions go in the slime jar
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
and
Yep.
then you can put the lid on it, in your mind and stick it over there on the table. Emotions are over there in the slime jar. Now let's just focus on all of the facts
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, it's critical to know when to use emotion, when to use intellect, because there's times if you want to blow through something and dig something up to grow from, you can spark the emotion. So it's saying that this could be a book in and of itself. You can dance between uh, focusing on memories and provoking an emotion in yourself and then sitting with it and allowing that to be a part of the experience until more data starts to come in. All of a sudden you'll start to remember things that you didn't remember before. You never forgot them. They were always there. But it's like, oh, okay, now I make that connection. So you can dance back and forth with this, but the key is mucking around with the emotions is how we get in the way of this. This is what keeps us limiting.
And just for that reference, it's Dunning and Kruger, unskilled and unaware of it, how difficulties in recognizing one's own incompetence lead to inflated self assessments.
There we go. Oh, geez, that is so applicable, isn't it? Ne- Negative and positive emotions are not opposites either. It's not one or the other. And there's so much about stay positive, stay positive. You're a negative
Right.
person.
Well,
Stay
now
away from the negative.
let's go into this for a minute. And this is a
Yeah.
hugely important issue. And back in 2010, and what I'll do is I'll put her episode up in the notes with this one. But I interviewed Barbara Ehrenreich, Dr. Barbara Ehrenreich. She's basically a social anthropologist, I think is what you'd call her. And she wrote a book called Bright Sided: How the Relentless Promotion of Positive Thinking Was Undermining America. And, I could see a tie back then into all of this stuff. I hadn't yet connected it to Huxley and the union of the caste system into our society. But, what is the deal with that? And then also calling any information that you haven't looked at or haven't studied, calling
Reality.
it negative, and then just
Yeah.
dismissing it, without even knowing. I mean, how don't you have to take in the information first to judge it as positive or negative?
Yeah.
And if it saves your life or saves you some pain or going down into some la la land for 5 years, how is it negative or
Positive. Yeah. 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 So remember what I was saying in the last slide that as information's emerging, it's rough, it's raw, and if it's confronting our structure of self and world, it's felt negatively. Well, if I tell you, stay away from negative emotions, I'm telling you to stay away from any new information. So do you get the dynamic between that?
Okay.
That
Yeah.
raw coarse experience is when this system of self and world is being confronted. This is where new information is, and the negative and positive are not opposite entities and independent of each other. The negative experience, if you know how to handle it and stick with it, eventually transmutes into something more positive, because eventually that tension between information and your carrier for information, your ability to assimilate it, that tension's released and
Here,
it starts to become a more
here's
positive
a
experience.
contradiction I see, though, is like, when that
Okay.
information is coming along and, you haven't studied it yet and you're reacting to it, and it's usually an attack on it. So then, you're reacting negatively, and you see this a lot of times with hippies and new agers, like you put out, paper research or something, and it will probably happen with this episode, by the way.
Yeah.
People who have not watched it and not, tried to understand what we're saying will just attack it. So isn't that behavior in and of itself pretty damn negative?
Well, of course it is. And what is it but rejecting new information which could bring you into greater understanding. So if you're rejecting the negative, you're rejecting any opportunity for greater understanding.
And yeah, and basically growth.
Yeah, and sticking to the positive is really sticking to information that you're already almost assimilated into pure consciousness, or just simply having the current intuitive sort of structure of that information being reaffirmed. So all you're
And
getting is
so it's a constant feedback loop, and so then you have to close everything else out, because if anything else came in, it would threaten that and potentially just blow it to pieces.
yeah, it to a great extent what the dynamic is the self world as a structure. It gets confronted, it breaks down, and then they restructure it in a smaller structure that can't contain as much experience. So, how many people do you know in a spiritual discover spirituality, and then they slowly drop off all their friends. They stop speaking to their family. They change their job, and then all of a sudden, everybody around them is thinking just like them. This is why the self world structure is being dismantled through the practice. Then it's being rebuilt in a smaller structure that can contain less information, and actively pushes out the information that would allow them to grow by saying, I'm only going to stick to love. I don't remember the negative. And all of this stuff is really about having a smaller definition of self, a new self. I've been reborn. I'm now Willow of the clan New Age. And
And I'm illuminated because I have this
yeah,
myopia, essentially,
yeah.
right?
And I'm not going to talk to anybody else that confronts that. So now I can't handle relationships I used to be able to handle. I can't maintain relationships that conflict with me. I'm only going to have relationships with people that call me Willow of the New Age tribe, right? And this is prevalent. I see this with people that when they move into it, they're average Joes, they're competent people, they work in business, they discover spirituality, and 2 or 3 years later, they're talking nonsense and self-help, and they don't talk to the same people anymore. They divorce their husband, they divorce their wife. Like, it's hugely detrimental. It's hugely detrimental. You can't have the
Do you
positive without
do
the
you
negative.
do you feel that that's the whole intent of it, is to cause that sort of reaction and destruction and within the family and society? And I mean, if it, and we're just about to go into this a little bit more here, but it's an attack on the critical thinking systems.
Yeah, yeah, without a doubt. And in terms of critical thinking, before you can think critically about anything, you need a body of information. You
So
need a body of knowledge. This is corrupting the body of knowledge.
So when you and we might as well bring emotion into this for a second. Looking back, and you were a meditation instructor, et cetera, for 10, 12 years. How does it make you feel now, looking back and seeing seeing what you know now in hindsight?
I mean, for a great extent, I see 10 years of my life that was really focused on this. To a great extent, a loss. I I I could have been gaining skills or building on a career to which I eventually did afterwards. Uh, but I lost 10 years of not doing that, of gaining skills and building a lifestyle and so on that I didn't have.
So,
I destroyed relationships with people in my family, without a doubt, from my own actions. And I also had people in my own family that I introduced into this stuff that destroyed relationships within the family. Like it's had a huge negative impact on my life, and I can draw a direct thread from all of those actions right back to the person who was teaching me. So it wasn't just a matter of flawed judgment. There is worked right into the rhetoric of these philosophies, justifications to make these really terrible decisions, uh, and rationalize them away as what I need to do next or whatever, and also never take responsibility for them. And it's pervasive in all of it. So I had actually only spent a short amount of time teaching, and how I actually came to these realizations was out of a sense of responsibility in teaching. I didn't want to be teaching things that I didn't feel I was qualified for. So I went back over a decade's worth of experience and broke it down and just said, what happened? What do I really know this? Don't I? How do I understand this? How am I relating to it?
so out outside of your own life, what can you see took
Out,
place in this? Like as in those who taught under
well, no,
you.
none of the people that I had taught had gone on to taught, because in short order, within a very short amount of time, my teaching went from teaching about energetic bodies and meditative practice to teaching about the questioning the premises behind meditation and the teacher student relationship being flawed. It was in a short amount of time, about 3 months, I went from being a full-on duped, teaching everything that I'd been taught, to saying, listen, if you're doing this, you really got to question these things, and if you do, there's gold at the end of it. And then I just stopped because there was no reason to teach people after that.
All right, so we're going on to what, slide
Um,
13
let's
here?
see, navel gazing. Yeah, I guess so. Oh no, the one point that I want to make about this, about the idea of emotional processing, and navel gazing and getting rid of positive and negative emotions. This is taking a pre-conscious process. And this pre-conscious process is how we collect our data, how we get a body of knowledge, and applying a logic to it. We're putting a why before a what. We're starting to process information before we've collected all of it. So we talk about the trivium used for mind control, where you switch the order of the trivium. Emotional processing mixed with meditation is putting logic before grammar.
So
Okay.
got it. Okay, so where did you in your studies come along and run into the trivium? I assume at some point it kind of they kind of
Yeah.
collided
So
together,
what had
right?
happened is I started looking at the education system with my daughter because, like you said, I homeschool her, and kept bumping it. It was almost everything I looked at, everything I bumped into through education. Eventually, bumped into the work that you do, and then it was food. It kept coming up. So I sat down and I started watching your podcast, and then you started mentioning the Trivium and the Gino Denning uh, podcast, and I was like, holy hell, that's exactly what I did 10 years ago around meditation. That I went back and I asked what, all the what questions, the what, the who, the where, the when, and then I asked why, and then I could see how all this worked. And it was really about reordering those questions and asking myself questions that I could find answers in an observable fashion, not a theoretical fashion. So it's not like I said, well, what happened in this meditation? Well, energy popped up the top of my head. Well, I didn't see energy. What was it? Well, there was a sensation in the top of my head, and there was a thumping in the top of my head, and then that subsided. So it stopped being about these definitions that have been passed on. And when I started breaking it really right down to observable things, it all started coming clear how meditation works, why these experiences come together, and why it breaks people and why they make these decisions. So,
Why it breaks people. That's a good, interesting way to put it. And all right, so let's go on to slide 13 here.
Okay, so at the end, when the distinction's made, it's come into the assimilation's finished, the perception no longer needs to play a dominant role. We essentially perceive and are aware of the object at the same time. For a long time, I pulled out New Age nonsense about resonance and PCAR and all of this stuff about the object and awareness in my mind are resonating and they join a union.
So
And
you're saying the resonance isn't
well, no,
real?
I can't find evidence of it in my own observation, but all I can say is that you don't need resonance. It simply means your perception and your awareness match.
And of course, anybody who makes a claim of whatever, it's on them and not on you to
Yeah,
disprove it. It's on them to
yeah. And
prove it.
for a long time, I bought into that. And when I started putting this together, I rethought about it and went, wait a minute, that's not necessary. I'm adding in information because I want to believe somehow my mind can have an effect on the world outside of my hand moving out and touching it. So,
And here's another thing that I wanted to bring up. Doesn't all of this sort of give the people that are involved in these Eastern religions the feeling that the weight of the entire world and everything that's wrong with it is on them, on their shoulders, and it's all their fault?
yeah, there's two sides of that. It's not only the eastern side because if you think of out of Europe and some of the New Age shamanic stuff, it's all about good and evil out in the world, which is a really dangerous thing. It's not only taking on the responsibility of the world. Um, it's an interesting dynamic because there's an arrogance there. There's an arrogance with that presumption that you need to hold up. So it becomes a dynamic of feeling guilt uh, and an active mechanism to avoid responsibility. So I can't say that you're necessarily feeling responsible for the world, but you are feeling guilt, and it's not really defined. And at the same time, you're finding really strange rationales to avoid responsibility in other ways. It's a really distorted locus of control. Uh, how can you be responsible as an individual for, say, wars in Europe? Well, I can't. So I find a mechanism in the back of my head to deal with that. And then I apply it to my personal life where I am responsible. So you end up having no control over your own life based on the assumption that you can control everything. I am God. I can control everything. But then the mechanism to be able to reconcile that gives you a rationale to be responsible for nothing. So it's a strange dynamic. They're very particular ontological structures between those objects. Uh, will encounter information and create an object that reinforces self-importance on one hand, but then create another object, and these are just mental objects, that segregates the rest of the world from us. So I'm enlightened, or I'm a meditator, or I'm on a path, and the rest of the people are mindless gray masses. They don't get it. We don't have to convince them. They're not capable of understanding. And what does that sound like? Doesn't that sound like the same attitude the elites had? Wasn't it Plato or Aristotle that said religion for the masses and rationale for the elite?
Yeah.
The idea of mindless gray masses, and it's intrinsic right in these meditative philosophies to adopt that mentality.
Interesting. All right, so page 14, attention, assimilation,
Okay.
awareness.
So we'll line these up and look at them and think of it as a progression. So I've got unconscious on blue and conscious on white, and cognition, which should be assimilation, as a gradient. And the point that I'm trying to make there is that the attention phase is something that we're unconscious of. Awareness is when we become conscious of it. Assimilation is a gradient scale. It's not on off. You can be partially aware, you can be almost completely aware, you can be almost completely unaware in that process of assimilating information. So with attention, it's raw data. It's information with no contents, no context. Therefore, it has no real meaning to you. It just is. Cognition is obscure data. It's allegoric. It's metaphoric. It's the realm of intention. When If we get a chance, I can go into the progression on how you advance in meditation. Intention is a very particular phase in it, but this happens in the realm of intention. It's being. So think in terms of emotion. I'm being angry. Body language again. I'm being this. It affects you in your being. The intuition and the impressions that you get. It's talking in that language. It's an iterative process of reality testing. When I mean iterative, I mean the output of one iteration is the input on the other. So that'll almost be a reference to nonlinear systems. So if you're mucking around with the system, the rest of the test loop is going to be contaminated. You need to unlearn what you thought you learned. It's also it's instinctive, intuitive. It's indirect experience. It's egocentric, and it's egocentric because it's a constant change between the self-world view, which begins by changing the self first, and this is why people become so self-centered around it. It's not just emotion or information or understanding in their head. It's the actual hardwiring in the brain. And it's important here too that you get people saying, "Oh, well, you're being egoic, or you're worshiping the ego." And what these people are referring to is self-importance or arrogance. The ego is a structure which contains experience. This self, the personality that these people are claiming is important or arrogant, is an object within it. So if you have people saying to you, you're being egocentric or you're egoic or that's ego worship, they don't know what they're talking about. Egocentric is about this structure, the entire structure. The mind, it will be preoccupied with defining world and defining self. It's got nothing to do with self-importance or personality.
Let me read you something. I think I sent it to you last night or this morning. I had found it in Michael Hollingshead's book on page 34. You mind if I read that here real quick?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. He says one of the most vocal critics was, and he's talking about his work with Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley at Harvard, and they're involved, they're trying to start this whole psychedelic revolution, and they're painting it into all of this Eastern philosophy, essentially, that Huxley had already written years earlier in his book Brave New World. He says one of the most vocal critics was Professor David McClelland, a professor of psychology, a Protestant ethic man, highly intelligent, an expert in the psychological basis of fantasy, a prominent Quaker dedicated to external achievement. McClelland had decided to bring masters to head by calling a meeting for the staff of the center in which he revealed in no uncertain terms his growing concern over the psychedelic project. To judge by the behavior of Mexican curanderas and Indian mystics, he said, one would expect the chief effects of psychedelic substances to be to encourage withdrawal from contact with social reality and to increase satisfaction with one's own inner thought life. Research reports from the current Harvard project, he said, are quote, not inconsistent with these expectations, end quote, and went on to note that, quote, initiates began to show a certain blandness or superiority or feeling of being above and beyond the normal worlds of social reality, end quote. He was concerned about a developing interpersonal insensitivity about the inability to predict in advance what a social reaction of the psilocybin party would be, or you could put anything in there, I would imagine. Mm-hmm. And he goes on to say, and religious and philosophical naivete. Many reports are given of deep mystical experiences, but their chief characteristic is the wonder at one's own profundity rather than a genuine concern to probe deeper into the experience of the human race in these matters. And impulsivity, quote, one of the most difficult parts of the research has been to introduce any order into who takes the drug under what conditions, and controls have either been rejected as interfering with the warmth necessary to have a valuable experience or accepted as desirable but then not applied because somehow an occasion arises when it seems right to have a psychedelic session, end quote. And then here's the real kicker right here. He concludes, or he concluded his statement with a warning, quote, "It is probably no accident that the society which most consistently encouraged the use of these substances, India, produced one of the sickest social orders ever created by mankind, in which the thinking men spent their time lost in the Buddha position under the influence of drugs, exploring consciousness, while poverty, disease, social discrimination, and superstition reached their highest and most organized form in all history."
And this is exactly what the dynamic takes. The thinking man's there to try to solve world suffering. And what do they come up with? A non-solution. And this is exactly what happens is as you
Bill, you're
yeah.
being negative. Go meditate.
Oh yeah, go meditate. Oh my goodness. Yeah. No, that's run its course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So
I thought you might like to hear that anyway. So let's go back to, we were on page 14 going into 15 here, but go ahead.
yeah, it's just lining up the differences between each of these phases. So as assimilation completes, the data clarifies. It's very descriptive. You have language for it, and it's the information as the information. There's no nonsense about it. It's the realm of will, of action, of doing. It's a distinction. It's mind reality synchronization, clear language. It's self-evident, like the table or the cup is self-evident. It's direct experience. It's object oriented rather than egocentric. It is what it is. And I think I have more comparisons here. Yeah, we can. If we go on to 15,
All right.
all three of these columns line right up with the trivium. Attention is grammar. It's your collection of body of knowledge. It's a collection of information for reality. It's the terrain of reality. There's no experience there yet. It's data without relevance or context. And like I said, there's no reality there. The assimilation would line up with logic. It's an iterative process of clarifying information into a coherent structure to contain the experience of reality. It's creating the map of the terrain. It's subjective experience, clarifying obscure data, partial and varying awareness. And then rhetoric, which would be consciousness. Now you're aware. Consciousness or awareness and rhetoric lining up. Awareness of reality. You now have the map and the terrain. You have a unique point of view of reality. I want to be very clear that reality is reality. There's not my reality and your reality. There's my experience of reality and your experience of reality. So this is a unique point of view of reality. It's not my reality versus your reality. It's a direct experience.
Which is exactly what they want to sell.
Yeah.
Your thinking is just enforce.
Yeah.
You're pushing your ideas on reality.
And I've seen this line drawn all over the
Reality
place.
doesn't exist on its own. It's
Yeah.
just all your mental construct. And then I guess what do they believe that your mental construct and mine have the right to exist, or it's
Yeah.
all just a reflection?
Yeah, and I had this conversation in Nepal with he was a young monk sitting in a field in Dolpole, and he had mentioned something similar, or maybe my translator translated it wrong. And all I said to him is, I assure to you, I am real. I am here in front of you. I'm not a mental construct of yours. But I've seen this line drawn all over the place. I even saw the other day somebody saying, well, existence is existence. It's objective. But then I have my reality of existence and you have your reality. And it's like, no, reality is real. Real is real. Experience is experience. The subjectivity comes in the experience, not in the reality.
Well said.
Yeah, it's got to be that way. Okay, so let's go on to the next one.
All right, number 16 here: grammar, logic,
Yeah.
rhetoric.
Yeah, and I've got columns and rows here. So what I wanted to line up, because I'm talking about not doing anything with it, the emotion and just let information come up, which sounds like it's avoiding thinking about things. What I'm trying to get at is this process is really sort of the grammar of the senses. It's the collection of our body of knowledge. So if you think of, we've got the 5, 3, 4, 5 senses, then we have the trivium and you have the quadrivium. Well, this is sort of the trivium of the senses. And the senses is sort of our grammar for the trivium. That if our senses are corrupted, we don't have much hope in coming to any sense of reality. So I've got.
Wait a second, but we have our teacher master there to
Thank goodness, right? It's a good thing I made my donation this month.
right, and he wouldn't have any personal, objectives
Yeah,
or
and if I'm
right.
sure there's a lot of people going, well, my teacher would never do that, and yeah, I have to keep in mind that there is a certain uncertainty around the realities that we create, and when you become a teacher, you've simply accepted those, I'll say, illusions as reality, and having a body of students helps you to never confront that. So there is something in it for them, no matter how sincere they are. Uh, it's still they are still defining your reality for you so that it can prop up the reality they've created for themselves. That's an important point to know. So really we're talking about the trivium of the senses. We're not talking about the trivium of the intellect. But we've got to acknowledge that one leads into the other, that we collect data from our senses, we assimilate it into awareness, and once we're aware of it, that becomes our data set now for us to be able to apply logic to it. We can gather our data set and analyze it. We can organize it into a coherent map, leading to understanding, and this is important. Now it goes into a realm of action. We can take that understanding into actionable items. We can develop an actionable plan, and we can be effective. So if you think of Edward Bernays and advertising, which I did for many years, is really about manipulating the center column. Or even education. I'm gonna tell you what to learn, not how to learn. That corrupts the middle column here, the domain of intellect. Meditation is corrupting the domain of awareness. So it's even going back even further, and it's a very precarious place to be.
How old is meditation, would you say?
When I look at it, and this is really me mapping out sort of the pantheon of deities that they have. You know how Thor can line up to Horus, which lines up to Zeus, and so on. There's similar deities in Taoist meditation. So, for instance, uh, Hermes could line up against Lao Gung. Hermes, I can't is in Roman is which again? Um, I can't remember now. But all of they have similar attributes both in their look and in what they govern. So, for instance, in Taoism,
Hermes is
yeah,
Mercury, right?
That's right, Mercury. So let's look at Mercury, Hermes, and then Lao Gung in Taoism. Uh, Hermes is winged or has the presence of wings. The Hermetic's the same thing. The wings on the Kardouche. Lao Gung is part bird, part man. They all govern law. They all govern speech. They all govern the same thing. So there's a very obvious common root to uh, uh, the teachings behind these mystery schools. And if you trace that back in their imagery, and from right back to the same similar situations or similar deities described in Bon Po from Lao Gung would be Dorje Purba, and Dorje Purba in Hindi would be the Vajrakilakalea. So all of these deities end up lining up against each other across. So there's really only cultural differences to them. And as far as I can trace that back, it's probably just pre-Babylonian, which would put us where about 6,500 years ago. Um, yeah, I think 65 or maybe 6,500 BC, as far back as I can go in both the East and the West. And it all seems that they have a common root, without a doubt.
Very interesting.
Okay.
Well, one thing I've always found interesting is this what seems to be a relationship between Abraham and Brahma.
Yeah.
The father figure and then the Brahma, the top of the cast. So,
Yeah.
anyway, why don't we go into page 17, types of
Okay.
meditation here?
Okay. So I'm breaking them down into two main categories and four types of meditation. The ones that I'm leaving off are ones that are more physically based, like Tai Chi, Qigong, this sort of thing, because it would mean a really detailed explanation around physical proprioception and how that ties into the mind. which I just didn't want to do the research for. So we'll only deal with the meditations that are particular to the mind. And you can break these into passive meditations and active meditations. Passive meditations is you're not doing a whole lot with your mind. You're not being very creative with it. Where active meditations, you're doing a lot of visualization and so on. And this actually does line up against progression in a lot of meditative traditions. You'll go from a passive meditation into sensory transformation and then into self-transformation. Okay, so the first one I'll say is single focus. A single focus meditation is you pick an object uh, of focus, and every time the mind wanders from it, you bring it back. So that might be focusing on the breath in the tian in the stomach. It might be focusing on the breath in the crown. It might be focusing on an object in front of you, like a mirror or a deity or something like that. And the idea here is anytime the mind wanders, you pull it back to the object.
I was going to say, and even possibly a coffee cup.
Or even possibly a coffee cup. Yes. It might get rid of the morning cravings. Yeah. The other one is expanding focus. And this would be more along your lines of mindfulness meditation or Kongjin and in Taoism, where anything that is occurring, essentially the object of focus is awareness itself. And this one I spent a lot of time with. If you think, okay, I'm gonna focus on the tip of my nose, and then a car drives by. Well, your mind goes to the car, and then it's like, no, I got to bring it back to my nose, and you keep doing this. With expanded focus, what it is if the sound of the car was a distraction, if it pulled you out of the meditation, then it means it wasn't part of the meditation. So the idea here is any stimulus that's going on that's disrupting the mind, you bring it in to become a part of the meditation. So think of it like music. That if you're listening to a song, you can focus on the cymbals, and or you can focus on the drums. And if you focus on the cymbals, the drums are a distraction. Well, you can listen to the whole song. You can listen to the whole activity within the mind as one object. And the analogy I like to use for that is that a still mind is like the world is a bus, and your mind is like a car. And when they're traveling at the same speed, they appear still to each other. And that's the idea, is that the mind never leaves the present moment. So expanded focus is really about that. It's about staying with present moment awareness without ever putting a constriction on it. From here, at that point, what I've just talked about was developing right concentration. And you can't really go on to active meditations until you have right concentration, the ability to just move your focus around, and also I call it right intention, but being able to use intention to focus the mind rather than activity. Then you would move on to sensory transformation. And the reason why I say that is because doing complicated visualizations, sensory transformation would be visualizing a landscape around you. So for instance, you can see mandalas from the top. What you're really looking at is an overhead view of a building. And sometimes there'll be deities sitting at corners and so on. The practitioners at first, the first phase of it for the focus meditations, they'd actually trace the mandalas. When you look at the mandalas in the East, they're outlined in gold. And they're outlined in gold or silver because it grabs the candlelight, and the monks in the monasteries there are able to see the outlines. And what they do is they spend hours just tracing, following the eye around the mandala, and they continue to do this and continue to do this as a focus for meditation. And then at some point, it'll pop out into a view for them, or they might just get a glimpse of it as a three-dimensional object. At that point, that becomes a sign of the teacher to move on to sensory transformation type meditations, where now they visualize that standing on that temple with that landscape around them. So you're creating a sky, if it might be a storm, you're creating a sense of space. How big is this? How far away am I from that corner? These are really complicated things to do. we generally can't hold more than 4 or 5 things in our head at one time. So to be able to visualize complicated and vivid visualizations like this, you have to make the entire space one thing. It becomes one space. And you call up that, and then the visualization occurs on its own. And it gets very vivid. But the point here is that you're manipulating uh, the your awareness, or your essentially your awareness of the world within your mind. You're manipulating that data, the world, your worldview. From sensory transformation, you would then move on to self-transformation, and that's where you're actually creating or changing your body into that of a deity or an object. It might be a Vajra, it might be the deity, or so on. And then it's the same thing. You go through a whole process of lightening the body, and then taking that form and literally changing the visualization in your body, visualization of it in your head on the shape of your body, and also try to change the sensation of your body to match that. And you will lose complete awareness of your body, and it will change shape. The actual sensation of it will change. So again, you're manipulating your mental proprioception at that point. Okay, so that would be the total progression through these meditations. Yeah, 18. So let's break these down, and then we can draw a connection back to the ontology that we talked about with the mind before. So with single focus meditation, you have an object, your mind is on the object, and then it wanders away. You bring it back to the object, and you continually do this. And sometimes how you do this, you might label a thought comes up, you go, this is thinking, and then return back to the object of focus, your meditation. And then sound comes up, you go sound, and then you bring it back, or sensation. But the object of the meditation, or the objective of the meditation, is to focus on a single object and restrict attention to just that object, become absorbed into the object. So external distraction is your sensory data. Internal distraction is your own thoughts, your own physical sensations, etc. So this is the suppression of distractions until all which remains is the object of perception and yourself, until eventually the self and the object merge. And that's the end game there, is that the self and the object merge. So I'll go on to 19 with expanded focus. Let me get the slide up here. The focus of attention is attention itself. So as external distractions rise, they're integrated into the object of the focus. So distractions cease to be intrusive and become part of the music. So like I was saying about cymbals and drums, you can listen to all of the music. That's the objective there. So anything that is outside of the meditation is brought into the meditation. It's constantly expanding attention. As thoughts and physical sensations rise, they are integrated into the object of focus as not as my thoughts, but as thoughts, and then or as just thinking. So it's not my thinking, it's thinking, and it becomes just part of the activity. So essentially what's going on is you're disassociating your identity from thoughts, memories, physical body, etc., until self is identified with awareness only. So it's externalizing the self, where the other one is suppression of both awareness of the world and awareness of the self until the one object is absorbed in. Okay, so we'll go on to sensory transformation. You're using imagination, you're using your ability to concentrate and form thoughts and so on to recreate the world around you. So you're using manipulation to use it, our ability to process sensory data and spatial awareness, and we're manipulating that. So we're manipulating the part of the brain that processes that information. We're replacing or overriding sensory data with this manufactured data. So it's the suppression of sensory data and the emphasis on imagination. And then you wait for a specific, seemingly unintended vision or sensation. And then eventually what emerges out of that is this self and awareness identified as one thing. Okay, then we'll go on to the next one, self-transformation. Again, you're using the faculty of imagination, but now to manipulate your kinesthetic awareness, the physical proprioception. We're overriding physical proprioception with mental proprioception. So we're replacing or overriding sensory data of the self with manufactured data of the self. So again, it's suppressing sensory data and emphasis on manufactured or imagined data. And then again, you wait for certain unintended visions or sensations to arrive. And the end outcome is, again, it's merging this self and awareness are experienced as one thing. Okay. So any questions? That's fairly, I think, fairly straightforward without getting into too much detail. Uh,
Yeah, I think that's pretty
yeah.
straightforward. What are we on now?
Uh, that's 21. So I'm going to move on to
20,
22.
21.
Okay.
All right.
So let's break these down. So what happens during meditation is through our own concentration, we're disassociating with elements which would normally comprise the self or our identity. So whether it's senses, it's thinking, memory, sensation of one's body, we're continually disassociating from this. My thoughts become thinking. Sound in my ear becomes sensation. An itch in my nose becomes impulse, and so on. We're disassociating. It's no longer my thoughts, it's thinking, and so on. So this is a softening and dismantling of the self until the only thing that identity rests on is the active awareness itself. Okay, so as thoughts rise, they're externalized thinking. Sensations rise, they're externalized as simply activity. Um, the physical senses cease to be my body, they're simply sensations, okay? Being redundant here. By doing so, the boundary between self and world is softened and dismantled until all objects in awareness, including self-awareness, are externalized until all that remains is awareness as self. Okay, I'm going to go on to slide 23. Slide 23 is the big one. The end game, enlightenment. Okay, so if we look at enlightenment and the descriptions of enlightenment and the experience of it from an ontological standpoint, this is what it is. Okay, so we've come to a definition here by by observing what goes on in the mind in meditation, not what we're told what it is. Meditation is the dismantling of self until self and awareness are one. I've said that 3 times now. During the last phases of the process. So this is really the mind is trying to make the distinction between perception of the world and world. The entire object of world from the entire object of perception. So this is the distinction that's trying to happen through this whole process that you're trying to create. As the last phases of this process, my awareness as self, right? I've isolated away anything that my identity would rest on into its irreducible component, which is awareness itself. As that last phase starts to come up, it emerges as a feeling that every object that I perceive is myself, because identity is comprised of awareness only. So this is the experience of I'm one with everything, universal mind, Christ mind, merging mind with the universe, etc. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that what they mean when they say
Well,
self-centered?
this definitely would be. And it's a very real experience. It'll start to come up as you'll walk down the street and you'll see people and it'll feel like you recognize everybody. And then you start getting that same feeling when you're looking at objects. And then it's a very palpable experience. And this is really what you're doing is you're creating a direct experience of the self-world distinction. And and you can go sideways with it. You can make wrong assumptions with that, right? So, and some of those assumptions is like now or my mind is the world, or I've merged with God, and so on, right? But it's essentially the perception of the world and the self are intrinsically intertwined. You can only experience your awareness by being aware of something. If you're not aware of something, you can't experience the awareness. So those two things are always at play. So it's a very hard distinction to make. You can't compare and contrast the object of perception from perception because you can only have perception when you're aware of the object. So it is a very difficult distinction to make, but it's a very real experience. So as one perceives the world, one feels the subject.
Or at least it
It
feels real,
feels
in other
real, yeah.
words.
So yeah, exactly. It's not.
All
It's
right. We need to
yeah.
make that
It's not. It's
distinction.
not. It's not an experience of reality, but it's very palpable, all the same. It's very palpable.
Okay, we are on page
No, we're
24
still on
now.
23. So one perceives the
All
world,
right.
one feels the self. Therefore, as one thinks negatively about the world, one feels negatively about oneself. So we're talking about all positive. So this is why. Yeah.
So and then sorry, what happens is it really creates an off balanced psyche because you're only focused on what you think is positive, and then therefore, I mean, how could off balance be enlightenment? Essentially, is
Yeah,
what
and
I'm getting
and
at.
it's well, this is the thing. This is when we get to the full definition of enlightenment, you'll see why. But this is why the definition of enlightenment is always very altruistic. It's because quite literally you are feeling everything around you as yourself. So when you kill the mosquito, you feel the death, right? And it's because your awareness and whatever's going on, the content of awareness, are felt as oneself. But this is only an insight. It's not a distinction. It's the beginning of a distinction. So I'll go on to 24 here.
So let me just interject here. You're talking about killing the insect and everything, and then I suppose this is where all of the
Yeah.
vegetarian stuff comes in and whatnot, and then the lack of fats in the diet, I would suppose, would also then go to reinforce
Well,
the whole
lack of
process.
sleep, lack of hydration, lack of fats and protein in the diet, all of these create a physical state of mind that is very close to meditation. It's a lower brain frequency. It's highly suggestible, highly susceptible. It's not much different than the meditative state.
And so then these people think that they're above everybody or whatever. Okay,
That their
all right.
meditative mind is carrying over into the rest of their day. So they're starting to carry around an enlightened mind, and it's not.
They feel that they're essentially above everybody else, the superiority
Yeah,
complex
yeah,
and all
and
of this
that's
stuff.
again goes back
Okay.
to seeding the experience that this is somehow enlightenment. And really, what like if anybody's stayed awake for a few days, I don't as programmers, you stay awake for a few days, you get a sense that things aren't quite real, or that you're breaking down a bit, or you're a little bit more emotional. It's because the
Right.
exact same dynamics happening. The structure of self and world is breaking down, but it's breaking down on a biological level. This is why insomnia can lead to delusional moods and so on. But you're doing the exact same dynamic in terms of these objects through lack of sleep or lack of protein or lack of fat or through meditation or through psychedelics and so on. So it's, yeah.
All right.
Okay.
24.
So the reason for this distinction, this idea that my mind is merging with everything else, is simple. Identity has been isolated to the only element that can't be reduced away from this, and that's awareness. Awareness of an object, I keep repeating this, I know, I want people to get it. The awareness of an object and the experience of oneself occur simultaneously. Existence is experienced through being aware of the object, and therefore I and the object are one thing. All things are one. We are all connected, or all things are connected together. In reality, what is connecting all things is my awareness. So try to get that for a minute. I'm experiencing everything in the world connected, Indra's web. What connects everything, the common denominator behind all of that, is my awareness of it. And how could you get away from that when you're in the middle of that experience? Because as soon as you become aware of something, it's now connected. And as soon as it's not there, it's no longer connected. So, but really, this is the crux of this consciousness's primacy and the union with the universe. Is what is connecting everything is your perception of it. That does not mean that that's an objective fact of reality. It just means that you're perceiving your awareness as self, therefore the rest of the world as self through your act of perceiving it. It's a very simple ontological structure, very difficult to produce though. So I am the other because my experience of my awareness, myself, while I perceive the other. So I am you because while I perceive you, I experience myself. I am because I am aware. So, and that's really what you're getting in touch with, that a core part of your existence is your awareness. But that's only one part of awareness. Because one thing that we haven't talked about awareness in all of this, which is on slide 25. And this is the idea that awareness has a volitional agency. We have control over it. And if people ever get broken, it's because they lose sight of where the volition within their awareness is. They think it's out there, or they try to take on control elsewhere. But awareness is an activity. We move it around. It's not just blanket. Our sensory data is just blanket, but awareness and consciousness is volitional. It's intentional. So the next attribute of this distinction then begins to emerge, and this is the volitional attribute of awareness. Perceiving the other is an action which I undertake. I am because I am being aware. I am the cause of my existence through the act of being aware. If I cease to be aware, I cease to exist. Okay? So the cause of my existence is the act of my being aware. I've created myself, and myself is the world. I've created the world. I am the creator. I am what I am because I am what I am. I am what I am because I am what I am. If you replace the ams with being, I am being me because I am being me. I am the cause and the outcome of my volitional awareness. So if this gets skewed, you could be led to the idea that you are the creator of everything. If it doesn't get skewed, and you have things like the trivium, and you can apply critical thinking while you're going through this, what you come to is one's core seat of autonomy. One's natural autonomy is realized. This is the core of our freedom. It's the direct experience of what lets me move my hand and change my mind. This is the core of what gives us action and freedom. So it's one's natural autonomy is realized, the interrelatedness of freedom and responsibility. I am the act and I am the outcome of the act. So I am the action. I am also the accountability of that action as well. And this is the only governing principle for volitional beings. So people that talk about natural laws, a natural law cannot be broken ever. Gravity is always at play. If I'm walking and then walk off a cliff, it's not that gravity took over when I stepped off the cliff. Gravity was happening before I walked off the cliff. Okay. So natural laws that govern human beings is this. I am free and I am the result of those actions. So this is really coming into touch with our own, not only ability or power in the world, but also our accountability. And also to what degree it's limited. This is the only natural principle of mammals, essentially. A bear is free to kill a deer, and the deer is free to run away. There's no moral judgments around any of that. And the law is never broken if the bear doesn't kill the deer, or if he does. The law is never broken. You're free to act or not. You're the outcome of that action or not. This is it. What's being circumvented in all of this is us coming to realize our own power. And the limits of our own power, and that power is intrinsically interwoven with our responsibility around our actions. This is a big thing, and this is what we never get to in a spiritual context. I did what I did because I did. I did it. I did what I did because I did the action, not because I had some intention in my subconscious here or that my mother didn't love me enough. I did it because I did it. I stood up and I took that action. I'm responsible for it, regardless of all the other nonsense. And this is what nobody gets in touch with. Is the relationship between freedom and responsibility. And this is also common sense. Nobody needs to teach us this. We all know this. I did it because I did it. Well, it's Popeye, right? This is not anything mystical, right? So, some spinach and some big forearms. So I'm going to move on to 26 to close it off. Enlightenment is the obscure distinction of it is the incomplete distinction of volitional awareness. When the distinction of volition emerges into awareness with the incomplete insight of I am awareness, it is structured as I am one with everything. Then the result is I'm God. Existence is awareness. Awareness is the cause of existence. I am the cause of this awareness. Therefore, I am the cause of everything. I am God. Thus, the primacy of consciousness. And it's an illusion. Enlightenment is an illusion. It is the ultimate illusion. the ultimate illusion. It is the ultimate play on our senses because it is a very palpable experience. And this is not exclusive to just Buddha or one or two people. Many people have had this experience. It's chop wood, carry water. Before and after enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Many people have had this. They go back to their life, and the people wrapped up into these lifelong pursuits of this are under the assumption that only a very exclusive few come to this. I've known people that have touched on this just by doing their job well or sitting in the woods for 3 days while they're camping. They've come to similar insights just by being calm and being aware, and it pops. And it's no big deal. It's kind of nice, feels nice, but it's no big deal. So that is enlightenment. Now, the next thing, and we could go into studies in science, we could go into definitions in Nyingma sutras and scriptures of the relationship between mystic states and psychosis. That the ontology, in my opinion, and from what I can gather from the research, is that psychotic episodes, delusional mood, and mystical experiences in an ontological sense are identical. The real difference is you can come out of a mystical experience without being entirely broken. I would wager to say you would always have some damage on some degree. I think some people attribute some of that damage as something they've gained, but it is damaging. And really, the real difference between psychosis and mystical experience is when you're going through a mystical experience, you know what's happening in the context of your meditation. You know you're doing it. So that volitional component again, you know you own it. When this sort of thing happens to people without them knowing why, it breaks them. And I've seen people enter into meditative practices, and they've only been involved in a short amount of time, say 3 or 4 weeks or a month or two, and they start popping into this right away. And that's because the structure they're dealing with was already very small. The self-world structure was already very small and very malleable. So they pop right away, but they have no experience behind it, no skill with it, and no context for it. And they go crazy. And it can take a very long time for them to come back. And in my experience, the people that do get broken in this, because I know what everybody's going to say, it's going to be, well, they were either practicing incorrectly or they had a propensity to mental illness already. And that's true. That does lead to these things. But it's also the people that are the most dedicated and take what their teachers and what these philosophies are teaching the most seriously that also end up with the most damage. It's really the people in the middle, not at the ends. It's the people in the middle that are protected by their own degree of disbelief. They believe it somewhat. They believe a lot of it, but maybe not this. And that really protects them from breaking down. So the spiritual context for the experience provides a container for the experience. Because it's happening in the context of meditation, you now have something that can contain that experience. You can now cope with it. You have a coping device, which is the knowledge that this is happening because you're meditating. So the practitioner can go through what is essentially a psychotic episode without having a complete breakdown. But it does break the self down, and then as you come out of it, you build the self back up, and you can build the self back up smaller, so that it can only handle friends that are also spiritual and get rid of that wife and don't talk to that brother-in-law anymore. Or you can build it up to be larger. And one of the keys around that is that insights, you don't lay insights on top of insights. When your structure increases, the understanding simplifies and can contain more information. So essentially what's happening in any meditative practice is you're dismantling and reassembling the self in a managed fashion. Now I've got a link in here from a thesis paper from Carolyn Brett called Psychotic and Mystic States, and I think there's a subtitle called Distinctions and Connections. It's very good in outlining both an ontological description of what goes on right up against a mystical definition of what's going on, and lines up really that they are the same, and really what the difference is where this volitional direction is. I am God, or everybody's out to get me, sort of thing. So I put that in there for people to read. It's dry reading, but if you meditate, it's very good reading. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So why meditate?
So why meditate? Yeah, this is the next thing. I've only laid out a few of these because there's a ton of reasons to meditate, obviously, and a ton of different disciplines. I could even bring in Christian reasons as why, and it would fit into what I'm about to describe. So let's run down the list. You're asleep. Meditation is a way to wake up. If you're not awake, keep meditating. Right? You're flawed. You're a sinner, or you somehow imperfect. Meditation is a means to perfect the self. If you haven't perfected the self, then keep meditating. If you are aware, you're not aware of where your actions come from. So you're not aware of or in control of your intentions. This is prevalent in Western society. I intended something, but it came out of my subconscious mind somewhere. These intentions lead to my actions, but it comes from somewhere else. Meditation is a means to merge the conscious and subconscious mind so that you can gain control of your intentions and then create better outcomes. You can attract things into your world. If I intend it, it'll happen. If that's not happening, then you need to keep meditating. You
So it's
suffer.
kind of a
Yeah.
selfish thing there.
Yeah. You suffer, and it's also the core behind a lot of psychology, is you're not aware of your intentions, but you've led to actions and led to a life that you're uncomfortable with. And the doctor understands what your intentions are by deconstructing your behavior. So go to therapy. Therapy is the cure. If you're not cured, do therapy. So it's another dynamic there that ties into intentions. So the other one, you suffer. Meditation's the path to freedom from suffering. If you suffer, then keep meditating. You are God, but don't realize it. Meditation is the path to realizing your godliness. If you are not God, then keep meditating. You're limited by blockages in your energetic body. I should talk about energy a bit. By blockages in your energetic body. Meditation, energy work, releases these blockages. If you're limited, then keep meditating. Uh, Long before I came to this realization here, I came to an understanding with energy work that energy is awareness. It's simply that. And when you start working with energy, it was work conduits through the body. What they're referring to when they talk about energy in the body, energy centers in the body, and so on, I know it lines up with the endocrine system, system in the body, and so on. But
Endocrine.
yeah, that's it. That's what you're manipulating through your body is awareness. It's not energy. I'm not saying energy and awareness are one thing, or that awareness is an energy or anything like. What I'm saying is that energy, throw that idea out. It's awareness. And this, when you work with it, at first you start to get aware of moving it through the body and so on, and then as you focus on it, it coagulates up. So you got to soften and soften, and then you're manipulating it only with intention alone, and then you start to find that it will move through your body of its own accord and go where it's supposed to go. So then you start to think, well, energy has an intelligence to it, and then you keep down this path, which if you're doing energetic healing work, you'll never get to this part because there's no biofeedback with it. But if you're doing these martial arts style meditations, you'll come to this. What you're moving around your body is simply your awareness. That's it. And the sensations that you're getting are psychosomatic responses to you focusing on different areas in your body. So this whole idea of the energy body being what contains our consciousness is bollocks. The energy is awareness. Awareness is emergent out of the brain. And it's just a side note. So let's deconstruct these things that I have highlighted in blue here on
All right.
page 29. We talked earlier about the teacher-student relationship being, a core problem here, or even just the philosophy to who's reading from them. There's some here that we buy into, and part of it's unspoken, that needs to be questioned, because all of these are double binds, and double binds is a term that comes from Gregory Bateson. You can find this on Wikipedia. Okay, and Gregory Bateson came up with the double bind while he's observing
Right.
war vets with schizophrenia, and
Well,
said,
and
"Yeah,
for those who are familiar with my show, we know Gregory Bateson was one of the key people behind the CIA's MK Ultra program. His wife was Margaret Mead, and hugely influencing in that arena. He's also the one that came up with the term native revivalism that we've discussed so much on the show. Go ahead.
yeah." So the idea behind the double bind is that you're in an impossible situation. He gives examples when I was reading through it, like uh, the mother gritting through her teeth after beating her child and hugging them, saying, "I love you," or "You have to love me." It's an impossible, unreconcilable situation that a person's in, and what creates it is that there's a premise that's unspoken that the person that is stuck in the double bind is not aware of. So what I'm saying is that all of the philosophies that lead us to meditation start with a double bind. You are asleep. You are flawed. You're not in control. You suffer. You're not aware that you're God, or you're limited by blockages, or you're limited somehow. These are all the first step to a double bind. These are premises that you must accept as real before you can start working with the entire system.
This is, I'm just, knowing Gregory Bates and what he did, the reason why he named it is because he had figured out how to manipulate it, you know?
Yep. And he even quotes Zen Buddhism saying that with cones are an impossible situation. Like, you can say to somebody, meditate on being genuine. You need to be genuine. Well, the more you try to be genuine, the more inauthentic you are, right? So it's an impossible situation. You can never try to do that. And to a great extent, most of what happens in meditation is like that. You can't do meditation. So you stop doing it, you start being it, and then you can't be meditation. And so really all that you're left with is a whole lot of time, your mind and your awareness of it, right? And that's when these distinctions start to pop, is in those moments when you're kind of confronted with the impossibility of it. But it's by design. Each of these imply that there's something wrong, missing, or corrupt within you, and it's beyond your awareness and beyond your control. So to be caught in this is to initially believe the premise to be reality, yet they're beyond your ability to verify them. So, are they true? So if you're doing this stuff and you're upset about what we're saying, I'm not saying buy what I'm saying is true. All I'm saying is ask this question: is the premise behind what you're doing true? And how do you know it's true? Did somebody tell you it's true? Did you read it somewhere? Or did you come to it on your own? And because it's beyond your control and beyond your awareness, how do you know when you've attained it? I don't know how many times people have said, "Oh, this has happened in meditation. Go to teacher," and teacher says, "No, it's mental wind. You're full of shit. That's not it. Go back and meditate." Right? So once you buy into the double bind, you have handed over the authority of who defines reality to the teacher, therapist, philosophy, or religion, which has given you the idea in the first place. As soon as you buy into the double bind, the teacher now becomes the authority on who you are and what your world is. They can turn around and tell you, "No, the sky is green." And you would do
Yeah.
everything in your power to believe it. So I'm going to go on to 30. Is the second component that's important about this, because if you put together a system of control that broke people, unbroken people would probably figure out what you're up to. So you can't just go along making psychotics. I think that's probably what happened as blowback for the CIA in the 60s. So seeding the experience. And this is essentially, you plant a seed in the philosophy that sets the context for what people are doing. So the framework of these philosophies sets a context and implies an intention for the practice. And remember what I was saying about emotional processing is putting the why before the what. You're adding an intention to your awareness, which is putting a bias or a filter on awareness. So what this does, it sets a context for the experience and then puts a logic in front of your grammar. Okay, so it's right there, but in terms of awareness. It essentially applies bias or filter upon awareness. It defines a context for the experience, which once it's set, creates the experience. So you can have a person going through this same process through, say, Native American New Age stuff, and they see an eagle on a mountaintop. You take somebody that's coming at it from an Oriental standpoint, and they see Lao Gung in the clouds. And it's because this seeding of the experience is what creates the experience. The reason why the experience can be created is because your self-world structure has been broken down. So if the student report backs the experience which does not fit the framework, the teacher tells them it's illusion. If it does fit, they're rewarded with more lessons, operant conditioning. So once again, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to operant conditioning, great. B.F. Skinner.
Yeah.
You had just said something that, and then when you said operant conditioning, I forgot what it was. I'll see if I can come up with it again. Sorry about that.
So I was talking about that the context sets what the experience is. What allows the experience to be created is that the self-world concept has been broken down. Go ahead.
It's not coming back anyway.
Okay. So so now what happens is if a person is creating experiences within their meditation and they go back and they report to the teacher saying, is this real or not? And the teacher now has the power to tell the person if what they've experienced is real or not. So now there was one issue I always had from teachers is who's to say what I've just experienced in my meditation isn't worthwhile, isn't reality. It's just a reality that you haven't come across in your meditation. So that used to always kind of bother me. But if you're going to learn from people, you gotta give into what they say, right? This idea that what you've experienced is either real or not real, depending on the teacher's consensus. It's a key point. So once again, it's deferring one's authority over reality to the teacher. And in the very root of this, it sabotages the student's trust in their own senses and sense certainty and their own judgment of reality. Now, this has gone to such a degree that I've even seen people say, well, I've experienced this in a meditation and I keep having dreams about that. And the teacher turn around and say something like, you were raped as a child. And then that person actively pursuing and trying to figure out if that was true or not. Spend months trying to find memories that they must have suppressed because they must have been raped as a kid. And there was nothing in their experience prior to that. There was nothing in their experience that would lead them to believe that. But just because one person uttered it, said it, it changed their reality. And that is a violation of the mind in the worst possible way. Okay. So at the root of this, no matter how sincere your teacher is, at the root of this, it's a relationship of control. So no matter how sincere the teacher may be, this relationship is one which undermines your innate awareness of reality. It happens through dismantling the ontological structure of self and softening sensory awareness of reality and then claiming authority over it. Now, the first thing that people are going to say, well, the teacher has to have some control or they won't be able to teach you. They got nothing to teach you. You've got a mind. You've been living with it your whole life. You can observe it because you can pay attention to it. You're the authority over it. Just use your mind. Nobody needs to tell you how to do that. Right? So, second last slide. More psychosis and meditation. We're led to believe that meditation is harmless. Right? But I believe by design, it's meant towards creating psychotic states. And then setting a context for psychotic states to elevate these experiences to something which they're not. So the double bind ensures that practitioners continue with this process in spite of adverse effects like loss of short-term memory, headaches, pain through the diaphragm, a sense of disconnect from the world. Sometimes you'll feel like you live behind glass. All of these things will happen with people, and they don't actually say there's something wrong here. Uh, but the double blind also works it in that these signs are actually evidence that you should continue to practice. So it's not just a matter of ignoring an adverse effect from meditation. It actually encourages you to practice because you're having them, and that's the real catcher between a double bind. So meditation undermines awareness of reality, yet claims to be the path to reality. If one is finding the reality defined by the guru is difficult to experience, then one should continue to practice, driving the person further and further from reality. And the one premise behind it is, who says that what they say is real is real? Who's the judge? And just because somebody said, I experienced something someday, doesn't give them that authority. You can find out for yourself. And this is a way to keep you from doing that. Seeding the experience allows the process to be controllable. So it corrupts the senses. It sets a logic which reconciles unverified data. So it creates a rationale to take these paradoxes and I mean, this is what all the sutras, all the religious writings are about. You get conflicting information, and then you write a bunch of seeming logic around reconciling these two conflicting views, and then call it a paradox, and then say the mystery can be found in pursuing the paradox. Well, no, it's not a paradox, it's a contradiction. So to reconcile the information, you have to pay attention, you have to observe, and then think. So it encourages it encourages a continual participation in the process, and it is a method of control at the end of the day. Okay.
Now, you had seen an outline that I've been working on a paper regarding psychedelics from psychotomimetic to psychedelic to entheogen. What did you think about how that overlays with your work here?
Well, it was the same dynamic. So this is the outline about putting a term on psychedelics, or the creation of the term psychedelic.
They're seeding it, right?
Yeah,
They're intentionally seeding that
yeah,
information throughout.
yeah. So if you define the experience as spiritual beforehand, it will be spiritual. So the question you really have to ask yourself is, if the context was stripped away, would the experience be the same?
And that's very interesting that you said that because, and I've said this before, the first time I had a so called spiritual experience on mushrooms or whatever it was that evening was the very evening that I had met Timothy Leary and Dennis McKenna. And I had done psychedelics maybe 200 times before then, in large doses and small doses and everything in between. And I never had a quote unquote religious experience until that idea was seeded into my mind by Leary and the rest of the people that day.
Yeah, and it's an important note because I think people bump into similar insights and come to the same realizations without a spirit. In fact, I would say probably 80% of the population comes to the same insights that spiritual people do, but they don't relate to it or talk about it in a spiritual context. So what I found coming out of this is I walked around thinking that I had exclusive information, I was somehow better than people, and bumping into people, and they all knew it. And they were all looking at me like, well, of course, it's common sense. Uh, but I was walking around thinking that I had some gold ribbon on my chest. And it's because these experiences are rewrapped in a spiritual context. It can isolate people away from common sense. It can rewrap it as common sense. So one of the things that first got me interested in meditating was when I was studying wilderness survival and gaining skills. I was out there for 3 months. There was an exercise where we would listen to the volume of activity in a forest. So the volume of the birds and the insects and so on. at 11 o'clock in the morning is different than it is at noon than it is at 8 o'clock at night. And so it's a rhythm that kind of picks up and slows down and increases. And if you can kind of figure out that rhythm over the course of the day for an immediate environment, if something disrupts that environment, it'll peak and then die down. So if you have a baseline of activity, say at 11 o'clock it's a 3 out of 10, and all of a sudden it becomes a 10 out of 10 and then drops to a 1, you know something's happened. Something's disturbed a squirrel over here, which has made birds fly away there, and insects responded here. So you can expand your awareness by just listening to the activity in a forest that has a lot of sound. So I had been charting this stuff out for a few days, and a buddy left camp in his Jeep. I think he was going to get pizza, and I was putting something on my Jeep, and I all of a sudden got this feeling like these guys are coming back, and it was a premonition. It's like they're gonna be here in 10 minutes, and 10 minutes later they came up, and I was like, holy hell! I knew they were coming, and a few more days go by, and yeah, we'd run into a poacher, and one of the guys went out to talk to the state police about it. So when they came back, it was a little bit later at night. The same thing happened again, but this time I got the same feeling. Some feeling came over me. Then it was like they're on their way back, and right after I could figure it out because off to the southwest there was a spike in the cicadas, and then it dropped off, and then a spike closer to me, and then it rolled over me, and then went behind me, which set a direction, which was back to where the entrance into the woods were. And something had disrupted the forest. It was in the direction of the road. So it's probably most likely them coming in. And all of that happened in a second for me. And it seemed like I had some sort of extrasensory perception, but it wasn't. It was just awareness. And it was little experiences like that I had that got me interested in the mind. But when these things happened, it wasn't like, oh my God, I'm psychic. It was like, holy cow, the mind is really cool. Like the mind and awareness is really cool. We can process this information. And when you strip the spiritual stuff off, there's still some pretty cool stuff about the mind. It's not going to be found in the deities and all this other stuff, though. So again, the idea of setting a context creates the experience.
So, what would you like to tell people about all of this?
Uh, I'd say at the end of the day that,
Like this last
yeah,
slide here, 32.
you got to question premises, and this is core to the trivia. You got to question the premises that you're being given for these arguments. So you're not broken. You're not asleep. There's nothing wrong here. There's nothing wrong in the world. There's not something out there for you to create or figure out. The process towards this enlightenment that everybody's looking for, it's a natural process. It's not something you need to do. It's happening all the time. You can get out of the way of it by not doing too much navel gazing. Uh, it what we're talking about today is really only about the senses. The intellect and critical thinking and effective action afterwards, these can't be ignored. Like you go from the sensory data, you need to move into the trivium. You need to move into critical thinking before any of that data out of your awareness makes sense, or else you don't have a complete understanding. By ignoring the intellect and shunning the intellect as some sort of lower mind or whatever, which happens all the time in spiritual circles, you're limiting your awareness. You're not cultivating it. You need to bring critical thinking in, and that critical thinking needs to lead to something that's effective, or it's not important. Right? So these next steps can't be ignored because they're critical in that whole iteration. If you don't have a clear view on what's come out of your awareness, when that feeds back into that loop of assimilation, you're going to be lost. You're going to be going down a corrupt path. So the suffering which you're attempting to reconcile is one end of a spectrum. If you say there's something missing in my life, or I don't feel well, or I'm sad all the time, I'm going to meditate to feel better. It's only one end of a spectrum. It's not something to get rid of. It's something to move through. Um, the other end, which everybody's trying to get at, is no different. In the quality and attributes of what they are, they're one and the same thing. They're just different ends of the same continuum. So there's no point in saying, I'm going to get rid of left. Right? It doesn't make sense. I'm only going to stick to left. It doesn't make sense. You got to have both. Right? So there's nothing inherently wrong with you, nothing to attain, nothing to do. You already have, always have had everything that you need. And I think the only reason why I saw my way out of this is I had a sincere desire to know truth. Underneath it all, if I wanted to know something, I really wanted to know it. I wanted clarity. I wanted truth. And if you do have a sincere desire to know reality and to know truth, you'll question what you're doing if you're meditating. And I assure you, you will come to similar conclusions that I have, that I've just said here today. So it goes back again. You ask what first, when enough data is collected, then the why becomes evident, and then when you ask the why and continue with the why, the how becomes evident. So you got to do it in the right order. Grammar first, then logic, then rhetoric. And really, all it takes is sincerity behind that to come to truth. It doesn't take meditation or gurus or temples in the East. That's it.
What is the single most important concept that you would like people to take away from Gnostic Media's episode number 202?
Yeah, it's just that asking questions in the right order. Question your premises. Question the conclusions. It's listen. The most important thing that we can give anybody, in my opinion, is the ability to use your own mind, and you don't learn that in meditation. You learn that through the trivium, and I don't think the trivium was something created. I think it was something recognized in what goes in our mind already. This is how we come to learn things, whether it's in senses, in the intellect. It's how we learn to do things. It's natural to our mind. The trivium is a reflection of how the mind works. So the most important thing to take away is take away the trivium. Right?
All right, Bill, thank you so much for taking your time to explain all of this. It's been very, excuse the pun, enlightening.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You're
Definitely.
welcome.
All right. Take care.
And that's a wrap.
Hi, you're watching Gnostic Media. Remember, always do your grammar first. Thank you for watching Gnostic Media. Check out our bookstore. You can get bookmarks, bumper stickers, the Holy Mushroom, the Sacred Mushroom, and the Cross, the 5-year archive. Thank you for watching our latest episode. Remember, don't take it personally. And please, do your grammar before contacting us. That's who, what, when, where, before why. Read the article, read the video, listen to the podcast before contacting us. We greatly appreciate it. Appeal to flattery. It's so hot when you do your grammar before contacting us. Appeal to popularity. All the cool people do their grammar before contacting us. If you like what Gnostic Media has been bringing you, please make a donation.